I still remember that afternoon in a way that never leaves me, no matter how many nights pass or how many cities I move through. The air was warm, the kind of warm that makes everything feel slower than it really is, as if the world itself is trying to hold on to something before it changes. I was walking beside my child, holding a small paper bag with groceries that I had carefully calculated in my mind before even stepping into the store. Every item had a purpose. Every cent had a destination. That is how life had become for me, measured, counted, never wasted. We were not supposed to be in that part of the city. Everything there looked like it belonged to a different world. The sidewalks were cleaner, the buildings taller, the colors brighter in a way that didn't feel natural to me anymore. Even the air felt different, like it didn't carry the same weight of struggle. My child walked quietly beside me, holding my hand tightly the way they always did when they felt unsure. There was a softness in that grip, a kind of silent trust that I had no right to break. I could feel small fingers wrapped around mine, and I remember thinking how unfair it was that such innocence had to depend on someone like me, someone who was constantly trying to stay one step ahead of falling apart. We stopped near a corner where a small crowd had gathered outside a bright shop. It was one of those places where everything is designed to attract attention. Glass windows, colorful displays, and a smell that drifts out into the street like a promise. I didn't plan to stop there. I couldn't afford to stop anywhere like that. But children don't understand calculations the way adults do. My child saw it first. A small stand near the entrance, bright lights reflecting off metal and glass. And inside it, something so simple it felt almost cruel in its simplicity. Fried food served in paper trays, warm and golden, the kind of thing that doesn't just feed hunger but creates desire out of nothing. One piece stood out more than anything else. Just one. Sitting alone on a tray, steam rising from it like it was alive. My child stopped walking. I felt the change before I even looked down. The grip on my hand tightened, then loosened, then tightened again. It was not a demand. It was not a request. It was something far more dangerous, a quiet hope trying not to be noticed. I followed their gaze. That was the moment everything slowed inside me. Because I saw it too clearly. Not just the food, but what it represented. The distance between what I could provide and what the world was offering right in front of us without hesitation. A boy stood near the stand. He looked well-fed, well-dressed, untouched by hesitation. He held the food like it belonged to him in the most natural way. There was no hesitation in his movements, no calculation in his eyes. He didn't look at the food the way my child did. To him, it was normal, ordinary, replaceable even. And in that contrast, something inside me tightened painfully. My child didn't speak, not at first. They just watched. I wanted to move forward immediately, to pull them away from this moment before it could settle into memory. But something held me in place. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the realization that I had been pulling them away from things their whole life. The boy lifted the food and took a bite. Simple, careless, effortless. And I watched my child's eyes change. That is the only way I can describe it. They didn't just look sad. It was deeper than sadness. It was confusion mixed with understanding too early for their age, a kind of quiet acceptance forming in real time. As if they were learning a rule about the world that no child should ever have to learn. Some people get things without thinking, and some people learn not to ask. My throat tightened as I looked at them, waiting for tears that didn't come. My child didn't cry. They didn't reach out. They didn't ask me for anything. They just slowly lowered their gaze. And that silence hurt more than any question could have. I remember wanting to say something, anything, a promise, a reassurance, even a lie would have been better than nothing. But I had nothing to offer that wouldn't eventually break. Instead, I felt my hand being held a little more loosely. As if even that small connection had suddenly become heavier for them. The boy near the stand laughed at something someone said beside him. A simple laugh, light and unbothered. And I realized how different childhood could be depending on where you stood in the world. One side learned joy without effort. The other learned silence as protection. My child turned slightly, not fully away, but enough that I could no longer see their full expression. And that partial turn felt like distance growing between us, even though we were still holding hands. I should have walked away then. I know that now. I should have taken them somewhere else, anywhere else, where their eyes wouldn't have to carry something too heavy for them. But I hesitated. And in that hesitation, something small but permanent formed. Not hunger. Not envy. Something quieter. Awareness. The kind that stays long after the moment is gone. I pulled them gently away from the corner, guiding them forward. My steps felt heavier than before, like the ground had changed its shape under me. My child followed without resistance, but they were no longer walking the same way they had been earlier. Their steps were slower, measured, thoughtful in a way that made my chest ache. I kept looking ahead, but I could still feel their silence beside me like a second shadow. Behind us, the sounds of that place continued unchanged. Laughter, conversation, the normal rhythm of people who did not notice what had just happened at the edge of their world. But for us, something had shifted. And I didn't yet know that this small moment, this single piece of food, this single glance, would return again and again in ways I could never prepare for. I only knew that my child's hand in mine felt different now. Slightly colder. Slightly quieter. And I held on tighter, not realizing that holding on is not always the same as keeping someone close. That night, I could not sleep. The house was quiet in the way poverty makes everything quiet. No soft hum of comfort, no background ease, only the kind of silence that feels like it is listening back. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, counting problems I could not solve instead of counting sheep. Every sound outside felt louder than it should have been, every passing car like a reminder that the world was moving forward even if I was. But what kept me awake was not the noise outside. It was the silence earlier that day. My child had gone to bed early, too early, without asking for anything, without their usual small questions that used to fill the evening. No, what are we eating tomorrow? No, can we go there someday? Just quiet obedience, like they had decided that asking might be unnecessary now. I sat up slowly, listening to their breathing from the other side of the thin room divider. It was steady, but different. I can't explain it properly, but it felt like something inside them had learned to stay still. And that scared me more than anything. Because children should not learn stillness like that. They should be restless. They should be loud. They should ask for things that don't make sense. That is how childhood is supposed to work, not this careful silence. I turned over again, trying to push the memory away. But it came back anyway. That corner. That bright stand. That one piece of food. And most of all, my child's eyes. Not tears. Not disappointment. Just understanding forming too early. I pressed my hand against my face. I kept thinking, I should have done something. I should have bought it. I should have found a way. I should have prevented that moment from becoming memory. But then another voice inside me answered back, cold and practical. With what? That question always wins in the end. It doesn't shout. It doesn't argue. It just stands there quietly until every emotional thought steps back. With what money? With what stability? With what certainty that tomorrow would even be easier? And so I lay there trapped between guilt and reality, both equally heavy, neither offering release. Morning came slowly. When I finally stood up, the light felt thin, like it hadn't fully decided to exist yet. I moved quietly, preparing what little I could. Simple food, simple routine, simple survival. Everything in my life had become simple because complexity required resources I didn't have. My child was already awake when I turned around. Sitting on the edge of the bed. Not playing, not speaking, just sitting. Looking at their small hands, resting on their lap. That sight alone made something in my chest tighten. I called their names softly. But they only looked up slowly, like my voice had traveled a long distance to reach them. I asked if they slept well. They nodded. Just nodded. No details, No morning energy, no complaints. I watched them carefully while pretending to be busy with the small tasks in front of me. I poured water. I adjusted things that didn't need adjusting. I kept moving so I wouldn't have to look too long at their stillness. But every few seconds, I found myself looking back anyway. They weren't the same child from yesterday. Not fully. Something had shifted in a way I could not name properly. We left the house later that morning, stepping into a world that looked unchanged but didn't feel the same anymore. I kept telling myself to act normal, to not let my own mind exaggerate what might just be a moment. Children forget things quickly, I thought. That is what people say. That is what I wanted to believe. But as we walked, I noticed something small. My child was no longer looking around freely. Their eyes stayed forward. Not curious. Not distracted. Focused in a way that felt too serious for their age. At one point, we passed another shop window. Bright again, colorful again. A display of things that belonged to a life just slightly out of reach. My child saw it. I know they saw it. But they did not stop. Not even for a second. They just kept walking. And that should have relieved me. But it didn't. Because silence is not the same as peace. Sometimes silence is just a decision. We reached a small public space where people gathered casually, some sitting, some passing through, some simply existing in their own separate worlds. I paused there to check something in my bag, and when I looked up again, I saw my child standing slightly apart from me. Not far, but not close either. Just enough distance to make my heart react before my mind could explain it. They were watching people. Not in the way children usually do, with curiosity or wonder, but in a way that felt observational. Like they were noticing differences. Patterns. Things I wished they would never have to notice. I walked toward them immediately, gently placing my hand on their shoulder. They didn't flinch. They didn't lean in either. They just accepted the touch, like it was something familiar but not necessarily comforting. "Come," I said softly. They followed. But something about the way they followed stayed with me. Not resistance. Not enthusiasm. Just compliance. And that word kept echoing in my mind as we moved through the rest of the day. Because compliance is what the world teaches first when it doesn't give enough room for asking. That evening, when we returned home, I made a decision I could not afford. I checked the remaining money I had saved in an old container hidden behind household items. It was less than I hoped, less than I needed, always less. But I still counted it twice, as if repetition could change the outcome. It couldn't. Still, I thought about that stand again. That single piece. That moment. And I told myself something dangerous. Tomorrow I will try. Even if it means cutting something else. Even if it means delaying something important. Even if it means uncertainty later. Because I could not carry the image of my child's silence again without doing something to interrupt it. But I did not yet know that trying to fix one moment sometimes opens the door to many more. The next morning, I woke up earlier than I intended. Not because I was rested, but because my mind refused to stay quiet any longer. It kept pushing me toward the same thought again and again, like a door that would not stop shaking even when locked. Today I will try. That sentence had sat inside me all night, growing heavier instead of clearer. I got up before my child, moved slowly through the small space we called home, and opened the place where I kept what little money I had. It was never much, and seeing it again in daylight did not make it more. If anything, it looked smaller than it had the day before, as if even it was tired of pretending to be enough. I counted it again anyway. Slowly. Carefully. As if careful hands could stretch reality. But it stayed the same. I stood there for a long time after counting, just looking at it, trying to decide what kind of decision I was really making. Because this was never just about food. It was about what I was willing to sacrifice from an already fragile balance. Behind me, I heard movement. My child was awake. I quickly closed the container and turned around, forcing a calm expression I did not feel. They were sitting up quietly again, watching me, not asking questions, not curious in the usual way, just observing. That observation made me uneasy. I smiled anyway and told them we would go out later. They nodded. Again. That same quiet nod. No excitement. No reaction. Just acceptance. We left a little before noon. The city felt louder than usual, or maybe I was just more aware of it now. Every sound seemed to remind me of something I didn't have: time, comfort, ease. My child walked beside me, without pulling my hand this time. That detail struck me harder than I expected. It wasn't dramatic. It was small, almost invisible. But it felt like a change in how they related to me. Not distant. Just self-contained. As if they were learning to walk through the world without needing to reach as much. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was imagining things. We reached the same area again. I hadn't planned it that way, but my steps seemed to know where to go even when I didn't fully admit it. And there it was. The bright stand. The colors. The smell drifting into the street. And that single piece again. Waiting. Like it remembered us. I felt my chest tighten before we even got close. My child saw it almost instantly. Of course they did. But this time, something was different. They didn't stop walking. Not immediately. They slowed. Just slightly. A hesitation, so small most people would miss it. But I felt it. I always feel it now. I looked down at them, expecting the same silence as before, the same quiet withdrawal. But this time they spoke. Just one sentence. Soft. Careful. Almost unsure whether it was allowed to exist. Is it okay if I just look? Those words hit me harder than anything else. Because it wasn't a request for food. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even a complaint. It was permission to want. And I realized in that moment how quickly a child can learn to reduce their own needs until even asking becomes something they negotiate. I nodded immediately. Yes, I said too quickly. Of course. We stood there for a moment. Just watching. The boy from yesterday was not there today, but the food remained the same, as if nothing in that world ever changed, except the people who could or could not reach it. My child looked at it quietly. Longer than before. But differently than before. Not longing in the same raw way. Something more controlled. Like they were studying the feeling, instead of drowning in it. Then, unexpectedly, they looked up at me. And said something else. I don't think I want it now. The words should have relieved me. But they didn't. Because there was no joy in them. No satisfaction. No comfort. Just a conclusion. As if something inside them had decided hunger was easier to manage when turned into silence. I crouched slightly to meet their eyes. Are you sure? I asked gently. They nodded again. But this time, I saw something behind it. Not certainty. Adjustment. And adjustment in a child is never neutral. It is always learned from somewhere. We left the place shortly after. I didn't buy anything. I told myself I should feel relief. But instead, I felt unsettled. Because I had come here prepared to give them something small, something simple, something human. And instead, I had watched them learn how to step back from wanting it at all. On the way home, they walked slightly behind me. Not far. Just enough to no longer match my steps exactly. At one point, I stopped and turned, waiting for them to come beside me again. They did. But slowly. Like they were deciding whether closeness was still necessary. That night, I couldn't sleep again. But this time, it wasn't just guilt keeping me awake. It was fear. Not of what I could not give, but of what my child was beginning to learn to live without asking for. That night, I watched my child longer than I should have. They were asleep, or at least they looked asleep. But even in rest, there was something different now. Their face was calmer than before, yet not lighter. It was the kind of calm that doesn't come from peace, but from exhaustion of emotion. I sat beside them in the dim light, listening to the soft rhythm of their breathing. At first, I tried to convince myself everything was normal. Children change moods. Children grow quiet sometimes. Children adjust. But I had lived long enough to know when adjustment becomes something heavier. It becomes learning. And I was afraid of what they were learning without me realizing how fast it was happening. I reached out slowly and touched their hair. They didn't move. That should have comforted me. Instead, it unsettled me further. Because there was a time when even the lightest touch would make them shift closer to me, like they were instinctively drawn toward warmth. Now, they simply stayed still, as if presence and absence were beginning to feel the same. I pulled my hand back and stared into the darkness. Outside, the world continued without noticing us. That thought always feels strange, how life continues in full detail for everyone else even when yours feels like it has narrowed down to survival. The next morning came without any change in my situation, but something inside me had already started to tighten. I decided I could not let things continue like this. Whatever this was becoming, I needed to change something, even if I didn't yet know what the correct change was. We left earlier than usual. The air felt colder, or maybe I was just more aware of everything now. My senses had started to sharpen in ways I didn't ask for. I noticed details I used to ignore: people's shoes, their pace, the ease in their voices when they spoke about nothing important. My child walked beside me again, but quietly, always quietly. No pulling my hand. No skipping steps. Just walking. Matching the world, instead of interacting with it. I tried to start a conversation. "What would you like to do today?" I asked gently. They thought for a moment. That pause alone made me nervous. "I don't know," they said finally. A simple answer. But it didn't feel simple. Because children used to know things immediately. Play, explore, ask, demand. Even confusion used to come with energy. Now, their confusion came with restraint. We reached a small public park area where people gathered. It wasn't the same place as before, but it had similar energy, life happening in fragments all around us. A vendor nearby was selling simple street food. Nothing expensive, nothing luxurious, just everyday things that most people wouldn't think twice about. I stopped there. Not because I had decided, but because my body moved before my thoughts fully formed. My child noticed immediately. They didn't react strongly. No sudden pull, no sudden excitement, just a slight shift in attention. I looked at them carefully. "Do you want something?" I asked. It was a direct question this time. No hesitation, no hiding. They looked at the stall, then at me, then back at the stall. And I saw something I didn't expect. Not desire. Not refusal. Evaluation. As if they were checking whether wanting something was worth the emotional effort it might cost. "I'm not hungry," they said after a moment. But I knew that wasn't entirely true. It wasn't a lie either. It was something more complicated. A trained answer. One that keeps life predictable. I felt something inside me tighten again. Because I realized hunger was no longer the only thing being managed. Desire itself was being managed now. We walked on. I bought nothing again. And I told myself it was fine. That we would try again. That things take time. That children recover. But my thoughts were starting to lose confidence in my own reassurances. That evening, something happened that I was not prepared for. My child sat beside me while I was folding a small piece of cloth, and after a long silence, they spoke again. Not about food. Not about needs. not about anything obvious. They asked a question that came out slowly, carefully, like they had rehearsed it in their mind before allowing it to exist in the air. Why do some people get things so easily? I stopped moving. The cloth in my hands stayed half-folded. For a moment, I didn't answer. Not because I didn't understand the question, but because I understood it too deeply. Because answering it honestly would change something. And not answering it would also change something. I looked at them. They weren't crying. They weren't upset. They were simply trying to understand the structure of the world. And that is the moment I feared most. When a child stops feeling and starts analyzing. I chose my words carefully. People's lives are not all the same, I said softly. Some start with more than others. They listened without interrupting. Then they asked one more question. Simple, quiet, almost innocent. Will I always have less? That question broke something in me. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. Because it was not just about food or comfort anymore. It was about expectation, about identity forming too early. I reached for their hand. This time, they let me hold it. But even as I held it, I felt something I didn't want to accept. I wasn't just holding my child anymore. I was holding someone who was beginning to understand limits as a permanent condition. And I didn't yet know how to undo that kind of learning. That night, after they slept again, I made a decision. Not a perfect one, not a confident one, but a desperate one. Tomorrow, I would try to change something bigger than just what we could afford. Because if I didn't intervene soon, I feared I would not just lose moments like the one at the stand. I would lose the way my child saw the world entirely. That night, I didn't just lie awake, I planned. Not in the hopeful way people talk about planning, with confidence and direction, but in the desperate way of someone trying to stop something before it quietly becomes permanent. I kept replaying my child's question in my mind again and again. Will I always have less? It wasn't just words. It felt like a line being drawn inside them, between what they believed life was and what they were beginning to accept it had to be. I couldn't let that line settle. So the next morning, I made a choice I had been avoiding for too long. I would look for help. Not the kind that comes from pride or pride-adjacent silence, but the kind that requires admitting you cannot carry everything alone anymore. I dressed my child carefully, even though our clothes were simple. I wanted them to feel held together, like nothing inside our life was falling apart, even if I felt that way constantly. They didn't ask where we were going. That was something I noticed immediately. A while ago, they would have asked a dozen questions before even leaving the house. Now, they simply followed, like direction itself didn't matter anymore as long as movement continued. We walked to a community center I had heard about from someone weeks ago. I had ignored it then, thinking I could manage on my own a little longer. But a little longer had quietly turned into something heavier. The building wasn't impressive. No bright glass, no polished surfaces, just a plain structure that looked like it had been built for people who needed help without wanting attention. That part alone made my throat tighten. Inside, there were people sitting, waiting, speaking softly to one another. Not everyone looked the same, but there was something shared in their expressions, fatigue mixed with hope that hadn't fully given up yet. I hesitated at the entrance. My child stood beside me quietly, looking around without judgment. That silence of theirs had become a second presence now, always there, always observing. A woman at the desk greeted me gently. No questions at first, just a simple acknowledgement that I was there. And that alone almost broke something in me. Because I had been living in a world where even needing help felt like something you had to justify first. I explained my situation in fragments, not because I didn't know the full story, but because saying it all at once felt impossible. The woman listened. Not interrupted. Not rushed. Just listened. And I realized how long it had been since I had been listened to, without being measured at the same time. They offered information, support programs, assistance, temporary help, guidance for work opportunities. Words I had heard before in abstract ways, but never allowed myself to fully enter. Now I had no choice but to enter them. My child stood quietly beside me through all of it. At one point, I looked down at them and expected boredom or discomfort. But instead, they were watching everything. Not anxiously, not emotionally, just taking it in. As if they were learning a different version of the world that had always existed, but was never shown to them. When we left the building, the air outside felt different, not physically but emotionally, like I had crossed something invisible. My child walked a little closer to me this time, not holding my hand, but closer. That small shift gave me more relief than I wanted to admit. On the way back, they finally spoke. Was that place for people like us? The question was simple, but the weight behind it was. I thought before answering, because the truth was complicated. It's for people who need support, I said carefully, for many kinds of situations. They nodded slowly. Then they asked something else. Is needing help bad? That question stayed in the air longer than I expected, because I knew what they were really asking underneath it. Is our life something to be ashamed of? I stopped walking for a moment, got down to their level, looked directly at them. No, I said firmly but gently. Needing help is not bad. It means you're still trying. They didn't respond immediately, but they didn't look away either. And I think that was the first time I saw something shift in them that wasn't withdrawal. It was curiosity. Not about hunger. Not about what they couldn't have, but about possibility. That night, I filled out forms. I read instructions. I tried to understand systems I had avoided because I thought surviving alone was stronger than asking. It was exhausting. But for the first time in a long time, exhaustion felt different. It felt like movement. My child sat beside me quietly while I worked through papers. At one point, they leaned slightly closer, not emotionally, just physically, like proximity was returning slowly without being forced. They watched me write. And then, unexpectedly, they said something small. You're doing a lot. I looked at them. That was not a question. Not analysis. Just recognition. Yes, I said softly, I am. They thought for a moment. Then added, is it because of me? My hand paused. That question was sharper than anything before it. Because children always think the world revolves around them first. But this wasn't ego. It was responsibility forming too early again. I shook my head immediately. No, I said. It's because I want things to be better for both of us. They seemed to accept that. But I could see they were still processing it. Still organizing the world inside their mind. That night, something changed. Not dramatically, not visibly, but subtly. When we sat together, my child rested their head against my arm. Not fully. Not dramatically. Just a small lean. But it was enough to make my chest tighten in a way that felt like relief, trying to return after being gone too long. And for the first time in days, I didn't feel like I was losing them. I felt like I was slowly finding my way back into their world again. But I didn't know, yet that recovery doesn't move in straight lines. And that even small steps forward sometimes bring consequences you don't see coming until you've already taken them. The next few days did not feel like change. They felt like waiting, dressed up as progress. Every morning, I woke up expecting something to have shifted simply because I had started trying. But life doesn't respond that quickly. Instead, everything continued at the same pace, only now I was more aware of it. I checked the forms I had submitted more than once a day, even though I knew nothing would appear faster just because I looked at them. My child noticed my habit. They didn't comment on it, but they watched me each time. That quiet awareness of theirs had become constant, like they were always trying to understand what I was thinking without asking directly. One afternoon, we returned to the community center. Not because we had an appointment, but because I couldn't sit still at home anymore. The waiting was starting to feel like pressure inside my chest. Inside, the same calm atmosphere greeted us. People moving slowly, speaking softly, holding papers that represented pieces of their lives they were trying to rearrange. I spoke again with someone at the desk. They told me the process would take time. That word again. Time. It always sounds harmless when spoken by others. But when you're waiting inside it, time feels like something you are losing instead of something passing. I nodded anyway. Because what else can you do when your situation depends on systems that move at their own pace? My child stood beside me while I spoke. Still quiet. Still observing. But I noticed something new. They were no longer just watching the room. They were watching how I was being treated inside it. And that unsettled me more than I expected. On the way out, they finally spoke. Do we come here a lot now? The question wasn't complaining. It was mapping. Like they were trying to understand whether this place was becoming part of our life or just a temporary stop. I think we might need to, I said honestly. They nodded slowly. No resistance. Just acceptance again. But this time, it felt slightly different. Less resignation. More understanding. Days passed again. I started looking for small work opportunities while waiting for responses. Nothing stable, nothing certain, just things that could fill gaps between uncertainty. Each attempt felt like stepping into doors that might or might not open. One morning, I left my child briefly in a supervised space at the center while I went to speak with a potential employer nearby. It wasn't far, but it was the first time I had left them alone in a structured place like that. I remember walking away slowly, checking over my shoulder more than once. My child didn't call out. They didn't look afraid. They just watched me go. That detail stayed with me longer than I expected. The meeting itself didn't go as I hoped. The opportunity required more stability than I currently had, more consistency than I could guarantee. The person was polite, but distant in the way people are when they know they cannot offer what you need. I left with nothing. Again. On the walk back, I rehearsed what I would say to my child. Something simple. Something reassuring. Something that didn't carry disappointment in its tone. But when I returned, I found them sitting quietly where I had left them, exactly as I had left them. Waiting without visible emotion. And that was the moment I realized something I didn't want to admit. They had learned patience too well. Not the healthy kind. The necessary kind. The kind that doesn't expect return. We walked home slowly that day. The air felt heavier than usual. Not because anything had changed outside, but because I was starting to feel the accumulation of all the things that had not changed. Halfway home, my child spoke again. Did it work? They didn't ask what happened. They asked, did it work? As if life itself was now being measured in outcomes. I hesitated, then shook my head slightly. No, I said quietly. They nodded once, and then said something that I wasn't prepared for. It's okay. I stopped walking, turned to look at them fully. Because that answer didn't sound like comfort. It sounded learned. I crouched down slightly. Why do you say that? I asked gently. They looked at me for a long moment before answering. Because it happens sometimes. That sentence should have been simple. But it was. Because, sometimes, is how people begin to accept patterns they should never have to normalize. I felt something tight inside me again. Not frustration. Not sadness. Something closer to urgency. That night, after they slept, I sat in the dark longer than usual. I thought about everything I was trying to fix. The system. The situation. The future. But more than anything, I thought about the internal shift happening in my child. They were not breaking. They were adapting. And adaptation, when pushed too early, can become its own kind of limitation. The next morning, something unexpected happened. A message arrived. Not final approval. Not full resolution. But a step forward. A confirmation that my application had moved to the next stage. It wasn't everything, but it was something. And I held that paper for a long time, just reading the same lines again and again, as if they might change if I looked at them differently enough. When I showed it to my child, they read it carefully, slowly, then looked up at me. Is this good? That question carried something fragile inside it. Because they were learning how to evaluate hope now. I nodded. Yes, I said, this is good. They seemed to accept that. But then they added quietly, does good mean it will change things? And I had no answer that could protect them from uncertainty without lying. So I said the only honest thing I could. It means we're getting closer. They nodded again. But this time, they didn't look fully convinced. Still, as we sat together that evening, something subtle shifted again. My child didn't sit at a distance. They stayed beside me. Not leaning away. Not analyzing. Just present. And I realized that for the first time in a long while, we were not just moving through survival. We were moving through possibility. Even if it was still uncertain. Even if it was still far. It was there. And that was enough for now to keep going. The days after that letter felt different, but not in the way I expected. There was no sudden relief, no instant lifting of weight. Instead, it was like carrying the same burden, but noticing for the first time that it had edges, structure, direction. Before, everything had been one blurred struggle. Now there were steps inside it. Step 1, wait. Step 2, respond. Step 3, hope it doesn't collapse. I kept telling myself that movement itself was progress, even if it was slow. My child noticed I was different. They didn't ask how. They just observed it the way they observed everything now. Quietly, carefully, like they were building a private understanding of the world without fully entering it. One morning, while I was preparing what little we had, they sat closer than usual. Not speaking immediately. Just watching my hands move. After a long pause, they asked, "Are you happier now?" The question startled me more than it should have. Because it wasn't about food, or routine, or survival. It was about me. I stopped what I was doing, looked at them properly, and realized I didn't know how to answer in a way that made sense for a child their age. I wasn't happy, but I wasn't in the same place I had been either. So I chose honesty, softened. I feel a little hopeful, I said. They repeated the word quietly. Hopeful, as if testing whether it fit inside them. Then they nodded. But I saw something in their expression I couldn't fully read. Not rejection. Not acceptance. Something like cautious learning. That day, we went back to the center again. This time, I didn't feel as lost inside it. The process was still slow, still layered in steps I couldn't control, but I was beginning to understand its rhythm. And understanding, even partial, reduces fear. At least a little. We sat for a long time waiting for updates. People came and went around us. Conversations started and ended. Lives intersected briefly and then separated again. My child didn't fidget. That stood out to me. They used to shift, move, ask questions. Now they simply stayed still. But it wasn't the same stillness as before. This one felt less like withdrawal, more like attention. At one point, I noticed they were watching a small interaction nearby. A child receiving something from a staff member, small assistance, a packet of support, something simple. My child watched without expression, but I could feel their focus sharpening. Not jealousy, Not sadness, just observation. Later, when we stepped outside, they spoke again. People get things here. I nodded. Yes. They thought for a moment. Because they ask. Yes, I said again. Another pause. Then they asked something quieter. Did we wait too long before asking? That question hit deeper than I could immediately respond to. Because it wasn't about today. It was about everything before today. Every day I told myself I could manage a little longer. Every moment I chose delay over discomfort. Every time I believed strength meant not reaching out. I looked at them. No, I said finally. We asked when we were ready. They didn't respond right away. But I saw something shift in them again. Like they were storing that answer somewhere inside themselves. That evening, something small happened. We were walking back when my child suddenly stopped. I turned immediately, concerned. But they were not looking scared. They were looking at a small group of children nearby. Laughing. Running. One of them had something in their hand, simple, ordinary, unimportant in itself, but the way they held it made it look like joy had weight. My child watched them for a long time. Longer than before. And this time, I didn't interrupt immediately. I just stood beside them. Let them look. Eventually, they spoke. Softly. I used to want to run like that. The sentence came out like a memory, instead of a desire. I felt my chest tighten. Because that, used to, carried more meaning than most adults realize. I knelt slightly beside them. You still can, I said gently. They didn't answer. Not immediately. Then they said something that stayed with me long after. I don't think I know how to want it the same way anymore. That was the moment I understood the real risk. It wasn't just about food, or help, or stability. It was about emotional distance forming too early. A child learning to reduce desire to avoid disappointment. I took their hand. This time, they didn't hesitate. But even as I held it, I felt something I couldn't ignore. We were not just trying to improve our situation anymore. We were trying to rebuild something inside them that was quietly reshaping itself. And I didn't know yet whether I was early enough to reverse it, or already late in ways I couldn't see. That night I barely spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything I wanted to say felt too fragile to survive once spoken out loud. My child slept earlier than usual again. That pattern had become more noticeable now, sleep arriving like a decision rather than exhaustion, as if their mind was choosing distance from the day instead of simply resting from it. I sat beside them in the dim room, listening to the quiet. And I kept thinking about their words. I don't think I know how to want it the same way anymore. Children are not supposed to lose wanting. They are supposed to overflow with it, even when life pushes back. That is what makes them resilient in a way adults often forget how to be. But my child was learning restraint instead. Not because they were taught to, but because they were adapting to a world that had not given them enough room to practice wanting safely. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness that wasn't physical. The message from the center was still pending final review. The progress I had felt earlier now felt more like a pause stretched thin. I found myself checking the same paper again, as if rereading it could somehow push it forward. It couldn't. My child woke quietly, as always. But something was different in the way they looked at me that morning. More present. Less distant. As if something had softened overnight, without either of us noticing when it happened. We prepared to leave again. Not for the stand. Not for food. But for updates. For waiting rooms. For systems that decide slowly. On the way, my child suddenly asked something unexpected. Do you think things will ever feel normal? I stopped walking for a moment. Because that word, normal, had started to feel like something I no longer knew how to define. I looked down at them. What do you mean by normal? I asked gently. They thought for a second, then said, like, not thinking about it all the time. That answer stayed with me, because I realized they had started carrying awareness in a way that never switched off. We reached the center again. Same building, same waiting, same quiet movement of lives intersecting briefly. But this time, I noticed something I hadn't before. A small notice board showing updated cases, names, statuses, people moving forward in invisible steps. My child noticed it too. They stared at it longer than anything else in the room. I watched their eyes move across it slowly. Reading, processing, not emotionally reacting, just absorbing structure. Later, when we sat down, they leaned slightly closer to me. Not dramatically, just enough that I could feel they had shifted their sense of distance again. And then they asked quietly, if someone gets help, do they stop being like us? I understood the question immediately. They weren't asking about paperwork. They were asking about identity. I shook my head. No, I said. They don't stop being who they are. They just get support. They consider that. Then asked something smaller. Is support something you have, or something you get? That question made me pause longer than I expected, because I realized I had been thinking of it as something external. But to my child, it was becoming something that defined change itself. You get it, I said finally, but once you do, it becomes part of your life. They nodded slowly, like they were storing that idea carefully, not accepting it emotionally yet, but placing it somewhere inside themselves for later understanding. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. A short call from the center. Not approval, not rejection, an invitation. They wanted us to come in for a formal interview step. My hands tightened around the phone after the call ended. It wasn't the end, but it was movement again. Real movement. When I told my child, they listened carefully. As always. But this time, I saw something I hadn't seen in a while. A faint spark of attention that wasn't just observation. It was anticipation. Not excitement, but possibility forming again. That evening, they sat closer to me than usual. And for the first time in days, they asked a simple question that wasn't about survival or understanding systems. Can we go somewhere after this is done? I looked at them. Where? I asked softly. They hesitated, then said something small. Somewhere where we don't have to wait. That sentence stayed in the air longer than anything else that day, because I realized what they were really asking for wasn't a place. It was a feeling, the absence of uncertainty. And I didn't know yet if I could give them that. But I knew I had to try harder than I ever had before, because something inside them was still reachable. And I could feel it shifting, not breaking anymore, not freezing, but waiting to see what would happen next. The morning of the interview arrived without ceremony. No dramatic shift in the weather, no sudden feeling of change in the air, just another day that looked like all the others, except I knew it was. I dressed my child more carefully than usual, smoothing their clothes with hands that were trying not to tremble. It felt strange, preparing for something that might decide the direction of everything while still looking so ordinary from the outside. My child noticed my nervousness. Of course they did. They had become too observant not to. But they didn't comment on it. They simply watched me quietly while I moved around, as if they were trying to understand what exactly I was afraid of this time. We walked to the center together. The streets felt sharper somehow, like everything had edges I hadn't noticed before. People passed us in both directions, each absorbed in their own urgency. I kept thinking how many of them were also carrying invisible waiting periods in their lives. Inside the building, the atmosphere was the same as before: controlled calm, quiet movement, paperwork, and soft conversations. But today, it felt heavier. Not because anything had changed physically, but because I was aware that something could change soon. We were called in after some waiting. A small room, simple setup, nothing intimidating in structure, but emotionally it felt like standing at a threshold. My child sat beside me. Still, watching, always watching. The person conducting the interview was polite, direct, but not unkind. They asked questions I had already answered in forms, but this time the answers felt more alive, more vulnerable, because they were being spoken instead of written. I spoke about our situation, our struggles, our attempts to stabilize. My child remained quiet the entire time. But I could feel their attention on me, not the room, not the person asking questions, but me. As if they were hearing my life, explained in a way they had never fully heard before. At one point, I hesitated while answering. A question about consistency, about future stability, about what I could provide moving forward. And in that hesitation, I felt my entire reality pause for a second. Because I didn't have perfect answers. I had effort. I had intention. But certainty, no. The interview ended with a nod. "We will review and respond soon," they said. That sentence again. Soon. Another version of waiting. We stepped outside afterward, and I felt the air differently again. My child walked beside me silently for a few steps. Then asked, "Was that it?" I nodded. "For now," I said. They processed that quietly. Then asked something softer. "Did you do okay?" That question caught me off guard. Not because it was complex, but because it wasn't about outcome. It was about effort. I looked at them. "Yes," I said gently, "I did okay." They nodded once, and I saw something subtle shift in them again. Not anxiety, not tension, but evaluation easing slightly. We didn't go home immediately. We walked slowly instead, neither of us speaking much. At one point, we passed a small open space where children were playing again. The same kind of scene we had seen before, but this time my child didn't stop for long. They looked, but only briefly, then kept walking. That alone told me more than any conversation could. Something in them was no longer stuck in observation alone. It was starting to move forward again. Later that evening, back home, I found them sitting near the small window, watching outside, but not in the same way as before. Not analyzing, not comparing, just present. I sat beside them quietly. We stayed like that for a while without speaking. Then, unexpectedly, they leaned slightly against me. Not fully, not hesitantly either. Just naturally. Like something inside them had allowed closeness again, without calculating it. I didn't move. I just stayed still, afraid that even a small shift might break the moment. After a while, they spoke softly. "I think I understand something now." I turned slightly. "What do you understand?" They paused, then said, "Waiting doesn't always mean nothing is happening." That sentence stayed with me, because it came from experience, not instruction. I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said, "sometimes it means things are slowly changing." They didn't respond immediately, but they didn't pull away either. That night, I couldn't sleep again, but this time it wasn't only anxiety. It was anticipation mixed with fear. Because we were now closer than before to something changing our situation. But closeness also meant risk. And I didn't know, yet, what direction that change would take. All I knew was that my child was no longer retreating inside themselves, the way they had begun to. And that small return felt like the first real sign that we might not lose everything that had started slipping away. The wait after the interview felt heavier than all the waiting before it. Because this time, there was a shape to it. Before, waiting had been vague, days blending into each other, uncertainty without edges. But now every hour felt like it had meaning attached to it, as if something important was being measured in the background and I could hear the invisible counting. I tried to keep life normal for my child. I made food the same way, spoke the same way, moved through routines, as if stability could be maintained by imitation alone. But my child noticed the difference in me again. They always did. One afternoon, while we were sitting together, they suddenly asked, "Are you worried?" It was direct. No hesitation. No build-up. I looked at them for a moment before answering honestly. "Yes," I said. They didn't react strongly. They simply accepted the answer. Then they asked something softer. "Because of the result?" "Yes," I said again. They nodded slowly, as if they were trying to understand not just my worry, but the structure of it. After a pause, they said something I didn't expect. "If it doesn't work, will we go back to before?" The question wasn't dramatic. It was factual in their mind. A possible outcome. I felt my chest tighten, because I realized that in their understanding, before had already become a category. Not just a memory. A state of life. I chose my words carefully. "We will still move forward," I said. "Even if one step doesn't work, we keep going." They processed that quietly, then nodded. But I could see they were still building meaning around it. That evening, something happened that shifted the atmosphere again. A follow-up message arrived. Not final approval. Not rejection. A request for additional clarification. Documents. Verification. More steps. It wasn't the end. But it also wasn't stagnation. It was continuation. When I read it, I felt my hands tighten slightly. Not with relief. Not with disappointment. But with the exhausting reality of ongoing uncertainty. My child watched me read it. They didn't ask what it meant immediately. They waited. And that waiting, I realized, had become their default response now, observing first, reacting later. After I explained it simply, they nodded. Then asked, "Is that good or bad?" I hesitated, because the truth was both. It meant progress, but also delay. I exhaled slowly. "It means we are still in the process," I said. They thought about that, then said something quietly. "So we're not finished yet." "No," I replied, "not yet." They accepted that without resistance. But I noticed something important. They were no longer framing things as pass or fail. They were starting to understand continuation. That night, I found them doing something small. They were sitting with a paper and trying to draw. Simple lines. Shapes. Nothing specific. But they were focused. Not distracted. Not withdrawn. Just engaged in something that wasn't survival or observation. I sat beside them quietly. After a while, I asked, "What are you drawing?" They looked at it for a moment, then said, "Just things." I smiled slightly. "That's good." They continued drawing. And I realized something I hadn't felt in a while. Not hope in the big sense, but stability in small moments. The kind that doesn't announce itself. It just exists quietly, while everything else is still uncertain. Over the next few days, we continued submitting what was requested. Paperwork, confirmations, clarifications. Each step felt like placing another stone on an unstable path, hoping it would eventually become a bridge. My child came with me sometimes now, when I had to go out for these things. Not always speaking, but present. And their presence had changed too. Less detached, less withdrawn, more grounded in the moment. One afternoon, while we were walking back from the center, they suddenly said, "I don't think I feel the same as before." I looked at them. Different how? They thought for a moment. then said, "Less far away from things." That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected, because I understood what they meant. They were no longer separating themselves from everything they saw. They were beginning to exist inside it again. That evening, as we sat together, I realized something important. We were still waiting, still uncertain, still in process, but we were no longer disappearing inside the waiting. And that difference, small as it was, felt like the first real sign that something inside our lives was starting to hold shape again instead of slipping away. The message came late in the afternoon. I remember the exact moment I saw it because everything around me felt suddenly too quiet, like even the air paused before I fully understood what I was looking at. Final review completed. My hands didn't move for a second. Not because I didn't understand the words, but because I understood what they meant. This was it. The point everything had been leading toward since that first day when I decided I could not keep pretending I could manage alone. My child was sitting nearby, still drawing in their simple, quiet way. When they noticed my stillness, they looked up immediately. They didn't speak. They waited. That waiting again. But this time, I couldn't delay it. I read the message again out loud, slowly, carefully, as if saying it properly might stabilize it. Approval granted for support. There were more details after that, conditions, steps, follow-up structure, but I couldn't focus on all of it at once, because the main thing had already landed inside me. We were not being left alone anymore. I looked at my child. For a moment, I expected confusion or hesitation. But instead, they were just watching me. Quietly. Processing. Then they asked, "What does that mean now?" I swallowed. "It means we will have help," I said softly. "Real help." They repeated the word again. Help. Not questioning it. Just acknowledging it. And then, slowly, something changed in their face. Not excitement in the loud sense, but release. Like a breath they had been holding without realizing it. That evening felt different in a way I cannot fully explain. Not suddenly happy. Not magically transformed. But lighter. Like the ground beneath us was no longer shifting constantly. We went to the center the next day to complete final steps. Everything there felt the same, but I felt different inside it. The same chairs. The same voices. The same paperwork. But now it all felt like completion instead of uncertainty. My child walked beside me, and for the first time in a long while, they were not scanning everything as if trying to understand survival. They were just walking. Present. We signed what needed to be signed. We confirmed what needed to be confirmed. We were told about support beginning soon, stability assistance, access to resources, guidance for next steps forward. Words that used to feel distant now started forming reality. When we left the building, my child didn't immediately speak. We walked a little distance first. Then they said quietly, "So it worked." I nodded. Yes. They thought for a moment, then added something very small. "Then we don't have to worry the same way anymore." I looked at them carefully. "No," I said gently. "We will still have things to handle, but not like before." They accepted that. And for the first time, they didn't turn the answer into analysis. They simply let it exist. That evening, something I didn't expect happened. We passed the same kind of open space again, where children were playing. And this time, my child stopped, but not at a distance of longing or silence. They just watched. And then, slowly, they asked, "Can I go closer?" It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't fear. It was permission to re-enter something they had stepped away from without realizing it. I nodded immediately. Yes. They walked forward. Slowly at first. Then more naturally. And I watched them stand near the edge of that small group of playing children. Not joining fully yet, but no longer separated either. Just there, existing among them again. And I felt something inside me loosen that I didn't even realize I had been holding for weeks. That night, we returned home and sat together without urgency. No checking papers. No waiting for messages. No measuring the next step. Just sitting. My child leaned against me again, this time more comfortably than before. And after a while, they said, "I think I understand now." I turned slightly. "What do you understand?" They paused, then said softly, "Even if things were hard before, they don't have to stay the same." I closed my eyes for a moment, because that sentence carried more healing than anything else I had heard in a long time. "Yes," I whispered, "they don't have to stay the same." And for the first time in a long while, I believed that not as hope, but as something already beginning to happen. The weeks after that felt like a different kind of life had quietly settled over us. Not perfect, not suddenly easy, but no longer collapsing under its own weight. Support began to arrive in steady ways, small at first, then more consistent. Guidance sessions, assistance that actually reached us on time, access to things that used to feel like they belonged to another world entirely. For the first time, I wasn't calculating every single decision against fear. I could breathe between choices. And I noticed something else too. My child was changing again. But this time, it wasn't the quiet withdrawal I had once feared. It was the opposite. Slow return. One morning, I woke up to find them already awake, sitting near the window, watching the light outside with a calmness that felt different from before. Not detached. Not analytical. Just present. They turned when they heard me and smiled slightly. A small expression. But real. We started going out more often. Not just for obligations, but for living. Simple things at first. Walking without urgency. Sitting outside without checking time. Watching the world without it feeling like a comparison. One afternoon, we passed a small food stand again. The same kind of place that once held too much weight. I felt a flicker of old memory rise up in me. But this time, it didn't pull me down. My child noticed it too. They slowed their steps for a moment, looked at the stand, then at me, and said quietly, "I remember this place." I nodded. "So do I." There was no heaviness in it anymore. Just acknowledgement. Then something unexpected happened. My child stepped forward. Not away from me. Not into silence. But toward the stand. They looked at it for a moment, then turned back to me and said, "Can we get one?" It wasn't desperation. It wasn't longing trying to catch up to lost time. It was simple choice. I nodded. Yes. When they took it, they didn't rush. They didn't stare at it like something unreachable. They just held it. And then they looked at me before taking a bite, as if checking that it was okay to enjoy something without fear attached to it. I nodded again. And this time, I felt something inside me finally settle. Not because food had changed anything, but because my child had. Later that day, as we walked home slowly, they spoke again. "I don't think I feel far away anymore." I looked at them. "What do you feel like now?" They thought for a moment, then said, "Like I'm here." Just that. Not more. Not less. And I realized how much of our story had been about distance. Between us, between them and the world, between survival and living. And now, slowly, that distance was shrinking. That evening, we sat together outside as the day softened into night. No urgency. No waiting. Just time passing normally. My child leaned their head against my shoulder again, but this time it didn't feel like return. It felt like continuation. And I finally understood something I had been learning in fragments all along. Healing wasn't one moment. It was the return of small things that had stopped happening without us noticing. Breathing without fear. Wanting without silence. Standing without distance. As the sky darkened above us, I looked at my child and felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel fully in a long time. Not just relief. Not just hope. But peace forming quietly from everything we had survived. And for the first time, I wasn't thinking about what we had lost in that one moment by the stand. I was watching what we had slowly found again after it. The night felt longer than usual, not because anything was wrong, but because I kept noticing how different quiet had become. In the past, quiet meant pressure. It meant uncertainty sitting in every corner of the room, waiting to become something heavier. But now, quiet was just quiet. My child had fallen asleep earlier than me, as they often did now, but this time their face looked peaceful in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. No tension in the brow, no restless shifting, just rest that looked complete instead of cautious. I stayed awake a little longer, not out of worry, but out of something softer, reflection. Everything that had brought us here passed through my mind again. That first moment, that small stand, that single piece of food, the silence that followed, and how that silence had slowly transformed into something neither of us understood at the time. I used to think that moment was the beginning of loss, but now I understood it differently. It had been the beginning of awareness. And awareness, even painful, had led us somewhere we could not have reached without it. The next morning came gently. No urgency. No weight pressing immediately against my chest. My child woke up and stretched slowly, then looked at me with the kind of calm that had replaced their earlier silence. "Are we going somewhere today?" they asked. I thought for a moment, then smiled. "Only if we want to," I said. They seemed to like that answer. Because choice had become something new for them. Something they were still learning how to trust. We spent the day moving without a plan. No waiting rooms. No paperwork. Just walking through spaces that no longer felt like obstacles. At one point, we sat near a small open area where sunlight fell softly on the ground. My child picked up a small stone and turned it in their hand. Not analyzing it. Just playing. That small act felt bigger than anything else. I watched them quietly and realized something I hadn't fully allowed myself to admit before. They were not just recovering. They were becoming themselves again, but in a new way. Not the child who existed before everything happened, but someone who had learned that life can break and still continue. Someone who understood both scarcity and softness now, and somehow still chose softness when it was available. That evening, as we walked back, they asked something unexpected. "Do you think we'll always remember that time, when things were hard?" I didn't answer immediately, because the question deserved honesty, not comfort. "Yes," I said finally, "but remembering doesn't mean living inside it." They nodded slowly, then said, "Good." Just that. No fear attached. No heaviness. Only understanding. When we reached home, they didn't go straight inside. They stood for a moment outside, looking at the sky as it shifted into evening colors. Then they turned to me and said, "I like how things are now." I felt something tighten in my chest, but not in pain. In gratitude. "Me too," I said quietly. That night, as we sat together, I realized the ending of our story was not a single moment of transformation. It was this accumulation of small returns. A child who asked again without fear. A mother who no longer carried every decision alone. A silence that no longer meant absence. Only peace. And for the first time, I understood that healing doesn't erase the past. It simply makes room for life to continue beside it. My child leaned against me, fully relaxed now, as if they no longer needed to hold themselves slightly apart from the world. And I stayed still, not afraid of what might come next, because for the first time, we were not surviving a moment. We were living beyond it.